Welcome to Telltales. I'm Mike Nicoletti. Every week, along with my co-hosts Jason Wallace and Hunt Lawrence, we bring you the Cash Flow Memo. Get it at telltales.us. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive deep into energy, technology, and healthcare. So download the memo now and get started.
Exhibit C is the exhibit on Iran. And I won't change any comment I made last week on Iran. I believe that the United States needs to declare victory and come home. I don't think the United States military assets can clear the Straits of Hormuz. And the earlier we do it, the better everyone will be, including the users of the oil, the Gulf Arabs, Iran, and the United States. I think these supply numbers in Exhibit C, I'll probably work them over a bit this weekend, I think will turn out to be reasonably accurate for the full year. I think if we turn to Exhibit B, last Thursday, the near month was for WTI was 94. The average price for 26 was 79. The futures price, average futures price for 27 was 74. I don't think those are going to change too much, because leaving Iran in charge of the Straits with them still having their 900 pounds of enriched uranium that they can make bombs out of. I think Israel by this time next year will, if they sense that they're working on a nuclear weapon, will go back in with bombs and missiles, possibly including us. Nothing like what we've done in the last 5 weeks, but still. And then the question is, how will Iran react? They'll probably slow down passage of tankers through the Straits just to register their unhappiness about seeing Israeli missiles and bombs. But that will be the status quo until it isn't. What could change that would get us back to thinking about $50 oil rather than $75 or $80 oil? I think it would have to be a commitment by Iran to take the highly enriched material, send it out of the country. When this happened during the Obama administration, they sent it to Russia to have UN inspections in 24 hours a day, monitoring what they're doing with their centrifuges, enriching the uranium material to, 15%, whatever you need to run a nuclear power plant, but not to 60 or 70%, which is what you need to make a bomb. And if they did that, I suppose the US and other Western countries would drop sanctions. But having Iran agree to that seems unlikely. As long as they don't agree to that, I think it's kind of the difference between oil being 60 on its way to 50 and oil hanging in at 75 or 80. But we'll update this each week. But as I say, this is kind of what I was predicting last week, and I wouldn't, based on 7 days of more news, including our president speaking tonight, I wouldn't change the commentary at all. Exhibit A, the dollar has been strengthening. Now it's a haven currency with the macro, but I do think that we will make progress on reducing our deficit, and not much other progress will be made anywhere else. So I'm thinking that we'll look relatively stronger. Now, the supplemental $200 billion is definitely going to increase defense spending in this year and next year. But I'm hoping that hard work on healthcare, which the Trump administration, to their credit, is doing, will help make up part of that increase in defense spending. With that, we've covered Iran. We're only about 5 or 6 minutes in. Mike or Jason, anything else to add?
Well, I mean, I think the things to watch in the coming week are there's a pause on strikes that's been extended to April 6th in hopes maybe that some of the negotiations that are going on bear some fruit. It's not totally clear to me who exactly we're negotiating with, because I don't know if it's really clear to anyone who's in charge in Iran. They have a pretty, they had a pre-planned way to handle what has essentially happened. And in the interim, a number of their leaders have been targeted specifically by the Israelis and eliminated. So I think it's really tough. It's like we talk about we're making progress in negotiations, but it's not really exactly clear who we're negotiating with. So I think that April 6th date is an interesting one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, and I was going to add that too. And in my experience, what the public news knows can sometimes be wildly different than the reality in a war zone. And it generally comes out over time. So whether we can believe what Trump says or exaggerates tonight, I don't know. But I think eventually we'll figure out what has actually been taking place the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. And last week we talked about helium and the helium issues. In the past week, what's happened is Airgas, which is the largest U.S. industrial gas supplier. It was acquired back in 2016 or so, and by a French gas distributor. But long story short is they declared force majeure on their helium supply contracts due to the conflict. So again, just extending the range and scope of impact beyond oil, which will have second order effects on inflation, but also to things that are dependent on helium.
No question, fair amount of helium comes from gutter. Very, very small amounts as part of making LNG. And helium is extremely difficult to transport, but that obviously, that flow has been cut off. And by the way, when I say declare victory and come home, I'm assuming no agreement with anyone in Iran. The two people who Israel has agreed to take off their hit list, the Speaker of the Parliament and the Foreign Minister. So presumably the United States must think those two people can speak for the government. That's not entirely clear. But I don't think there'll be any agreement with Iran. I think we'll just stop, and Israel will stop dropping bombs and sending off missiles. I mean, what this depends on is the Iranians agreeing or kind of cooperating by not sending more missiles at Israel or at the Gulf Arabs or drones. And so both sides will just stand down and we'll try to get back to normal in terms of traffic through the straits. So I kind of suspect, especially Jason, have better feel for this, but because he's right about knowing more than the public knows, but I kind of suspect that there isn't anyone in Iran who has sufficient authority to enter into an agreement. They're still probably working that out. But I think that the guards units, whoever's in control of missiles and drones and whatnot, can be persuaded to cease sending off missiles and drones in return for not seeing Israeli bombs and missiles or U.S. bombs and missiles. And so they'll just be kind of an armed truce. And that's why I think oil's more likely to stay in that 75 or 80 range, because the risk premium on oil, which is always a factor, will just stay elevated. The only thing that will keep it from staying elevated is to see the Iranians either by agreement or by practice just kind of give up on trying to make bombs. as long as they're making bombs, appearing to be making nuclear weapons, the Israelis will be active with their bombs and missiles and will probably come in alongside them. So
Yeah.
that's the situation.
We have seen one thing kind of historic happen over there already, is that you have a handful of Muslim nations that are partnering with the Jewish state and the United States in attacking Iran. So that would have been unheard of
years ago.
1 year ago.
Yeah.
1 year ago.
Yeah. True. Well, the ultimate goal, and Trump will probably get to this sometime during his talk tonight, is to have Saudi Arabia recognize Israel. And I think Hamas, there's a fair amount of evidence that Hamas in October 23 acted independent of Iran. And their apparent goal by killing 1,000 Jewish citizens or visitors and taking people in captivity and raping women and whatnot was to do something so horrific to slow down the process of Saudi recognizing Israel. And I think if you're managing Iran's affairs, you're probably horrified if well, first of all, you may have been assassinated by bombs or missiles. But if you're still alive, let's say you're the head of the parliament, who's considered by most Iranians to be a pretty good guy. He was mayor of Tehran, apparently a very successful mayor of Tehran. And to this day, he's a motorcycle fan and spends a lot of time, apparently without guards, riding around Tehran on his motorcycle. So he's considered to be more than satisfactory as a potential political leader. If we had a conversation with him, or if he had a conversation with the world and he was honest, I think he'd say that move by Hamas in October 23 was a total disaster for Iran, because Hamas is never going to be in control of Gaza again. Israel will hang on to at least half of it. Hezbollah has been totally annihilated in Lebanon, and more going on now. Syria has changed to be a government that's not going to cooperate with Iran. And now we've had all the bombardment, including the B-2s last spring, and now again. So what the ultimate goal here in terms of trying to have a wealthy Iran that gets into high real GNP growth for some number of years, while its GNP per capita comes back to what it otherwise would have been without this kind of radical theocratic government. And why does Saudi Arabia want to recognize Israel? I'm going to say something that Mike and Jason probably will say, Hunt's exaggerating, but I think some percentage, maybe 20% of successful venture-backed companies are led by Israeli engineers, many of whom, maybe a vast majority of, come out of the Israeli military. And I think Saudi Arabia looks at that, the leadership of Saudi Arabia looks at that and says, wouldn't it be better to graft those people into our effort to make ourselves independent of crude and try to build our country, as compared to relying on the US or China or wherever else we might get that expertise. So I think there is a long-term goal here by the leadership in Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel. And Saudi Arabia being Sunni, Iran, most of Iran being Shia, having a schism, you would have said 10 years ago that there's no way that Israel and Saudi Arabia will cohabitate. They've had fairly normal relations until Iran started firing missiles and drones at Saudi Arabia in the last 5 weeks. I think those can be restored. And the other most wealthy or most influential government in the Middle East is the Emirates, Abu Dhabi. And I think the same is true there. So there is the possibility that things could get much, much better in the Middle East, but that's There are a lot of conditions there. And one of the conditions would have to be emergence of a government in Iran who doesn't give up the centrifuges, but gives up trying to enrich uranium beyond 15 or 20% or whatever you need for power plants, and gets the sanctions off and gets the government going again. If you went interviewed or did a composite interview of all 90 million Iranians, they would like to change their constitution. The constitution put in after the fall of the Shah requires the final say in politics to the supreme leader. The supreme leader is elected when the supreme leader dies. There have only been two. Now there's a third. In the whole of 47 years, when the supreme leader dies, his successor is elected by the Council of Guardians, which is 80 or 90 old, I guess, well-educated clergy. The average Iranian would like to change the constitution, and they have a president, they have a parliament. The way things work now, the supreme leader had to approve anyone who ran for president or ran for parliament. So they just want to get rid of that system. They think that system has caused them to be impoverished and completely kind of degraded their existence, and they don't want it anymore. Now, whether that translates into getting a government somehow, I mean, what's going to go on now if there's kind of an arms truce? It's kind of like Game of Thrones. Will that fellow who runs the parliament, who ran Tehran as mayor very successfully for about 10 years, will he emerge? Will he decide that he can get a consensus amongst the guards generals who remain, the ones who hadn't been assassinated, to go off and redo the Constitution? I mean, there's a whole bunch of ifs there. But there is the possibility of just a really outstanding result. But I think if something like that happened, we'd be back with $60 oil going to 50. But it just seems too many conditions to have something like that happen. But we'll see. And we'll hear what Donald J. Trump thinks about it all tonight. I'm hoping that he holds the speech to about 15 or 20 minutes, or 10 to 15 minutes. Goes on, it comes off pretty quickly, and then try to continue on without, and try to calm things down. The world oil industry does not work with the straits closed. I mean, there's no price mechanism that will solve the kind of shortages that are already starting to develop. And so the earliest we can, from a world commerce point of view, get the straits open, even if the government of Iran is getting paid for every barrel that goes by, the earlier that gets open, the better for everyone. Wow, we chewed through 20 minutes, so much for using only 6 minutes. I guess we better get to some other subjects, or otherwise we'll be criticized by all our listeners for spending too much time on Iran. What's next, Jason, in terms of news?
Well, one thing I'm interested is the Artemis II mission launches later today as well. So it's the first time the 4 U.S. astronauts are going to go into lunar orbit. It'll be the first time we've returned to the moon since 1972.
Oh, they're just going to lunar orbit, though. They're not actually
not
landing.
landing. Yeah.
Jason, I don't want to be a hair shirt about this, but this does not include SpaceX. I mean,
It does not.
It's a Boeing rocket with the Lockheed capsule.
It's more than that. Yeah, it's a typical government program. It's Boeing, it's ULA, which is Boeing and Lockheed. It's Northrop Grumman, it's L3 Harris, and as you said, Lockheed Martin built the capsule on top that the crew goes into. And each launch costs about $4 billion of this rocket, and comparably, it's theorized that the SpaceX cost to launch a super heavy will come in at $90 million.
Oh.
So it's expensive.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be better if they just found a link or something and put this off indefinitely and waited till SpaceX got their large rocket ready?
Yeah, I don't know. It's been in planning for a long, long time. At this point, you'd be hard pressed to give launch contracts to ULA going forward over SpaceX. I mean, SpaceX has a monopoly on space launch right now. I think they're 95% of all pounds to orbit.
You look at the number, and it's also the cheapest.
Yeah.
So they have scale economies that no one can even consider comparing to.
Right. Well, SpaceX will be a public company by this time next year, I guess.
Yeah, I think they're filing this week for their IPO.
Right.
Yeah.
And SpaceX will own XAI, the language model, and I believe it also owns X, former Twitter.
It does.
What else is in the news? There's a big birthday today. 2 of them, actually. But Apple turns 50, and Mike turns something less than 50.
And it's not April Fool's jokes.
No.
Yeah. What about Apple? When we look at page 1, we see how low capex is at Apple and how much Microsoft is spending and Amazon is spending and Alphabet is spending. Jason, you're the
Bear?
well, I don't know if bear is the right word, but I mean your commentary on Apple is always worth listening to. Is it possible that with their 2,000 devices or whatever they are, that they'll come through this okay, because that people will use agents, maybe not Apple's agent, probably not Apple's agent, but everyone will be using their iPhones to access their agents? Or how does the next couple of years look for Apple from your standpoint?
I think so. I've changed my mind. I think Apple is looking more and more in a really good position. They have the user base, and they could come to a point where they innovate on Siri, where Siri is that agent. And as we've pointed out numerous times, they haven't invested in the language models that power it. But if Siri farms out all the tasks that it needs to do to any handful of the language models, and maybe the user can select which ones, Siri just remains that agent that orchestrates that. And that could be a very powerful position, because now Siri's managing your subscription to these platforms. Apple gets their 30% or 15% take on it, and they remain the gatekeeper. I think where I was wrong is they announced a bunch of enhancements to Siri 2 years ago and then did not deliver them, and have then delayed them for years. And I thought by now that the competition would have released something, maybe Android would have came out with something, that agent base that we're looking at for later this year that we expect. I thought that would have come a year ago, and maybe there would have been iPhone apps that also filled that gap, but that hasn't occurred. And Apple looks like they're okay waiting it out. They've waited out 2.5 years. So maybe maybe that was the best, and they didn't spend a massive amount of money. So maybe it was the best case for them.
Or what's
happening? You're the bear now?
I'm going to flip on the other side. Or what's happening is what happened to Intel, right? When the bean counters took over at Intel, they stopped keeping up with. Long story short is they stayed on DUV and didn't want to move over to EUV. They were trying to make older technology work on a node that wasn't really, they weren't using the right technology on the particular node. They were trying to make it work for cost sake. And I think what's happening at Apple is they're looking at it saying, we're going to have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to really make Siri right, just on infrastructure. I mean, forget the software licensing costs. They've got to deal with Google for that. But they're going to have to spend a lot more on infrastructure than they thought they were going to have to. So I think they're likely to chicken out. And, well, I'm not that convicted in this, so don't take this to the bank. But I think there's a likelihood that they chicken out and instead provide the ability to open up their platform to other model providers. And you will opt into that and thereby basically grant access to all your data to OpenAI or Anthropic or whoever. And with those successive steps, they will completely undermine the commitment that they made to their customers over the past decades. And that will be the seeds of its own destruction that will take a long time. And that might not happen, but that's the bear case.
Let me try a medium case on the two of you. And we got to do a little healthcare at some point. But is it possible that they just leave Siri as is, don't spend a lot of money on it, and have an agent like OpenClaw be the, your access to OpenClaw will be through your iPhone? Why wouldn't that be better? Why wouldn't that work from an Apple point of view? You avoid the capex. You continue to be able to sell a lot of refresh iPhones. You don't worry too much about Samsung and Google coming up with something that will lure people away from their iPhones. I know it sounds wishy-washy, but how does that middle case sound? To try to keep from blowing yourself up and becoming Intel.
Right. And let me give my perspective here, because I think this is important. You talk to anybody that has an iPhone, how many iPhone owners fret about the price of an iPhone? This is a product that provides consumer surplus that is significantly above the purchase cost. So much so that really people don't complain. You may marginally make a decision to choose the Pro versus the regular versus an SE. But for the top wealthiest 10% of the world, which is more than 50% of the US, it's a default decision because different aspects of the phone provide a lot of value. And what this signals to me is that the company has shifted to a defensive mode where every single decision is now being challenged with a specific IRR hurdle, which is exactly what corporate finance would teach you to do. But it fails to capture what the value of the product to the customer and the risk of letting other people catch up. We know that OpenAI has a very large hardware software integration project going on. They've hired the best people they can get a hold of from Apple. I'm not saying that they're definitely going to come out with something better, but what's happening is a lot of people are looking, not only, we talk a lot about NVIDIA, people coming after NVIDIA's chips. We don't talk a lot about Apple. Apple's the one with $115 billion of free cash flow. That's a huge target on your back. And I think we're kind of silently assuming that they're going to maintain their position when there is a lot of incentive to capture that spot.
Yeah, I think that middle of the road case is a lot of Apple's moat is their operating system and the app ecosystem. And the more that gets farmed out to a third party OpenClaw or another AI agent, the more that Apple moat is eroding. And you could maybe swap to a different phone maker and keep your AI agent. You know, as
you also have negotiating. I mean, think of Michael Porter's 5 forces, right? So you have the negotiating power of your suppliers. All of a sudden, you have Anthropic and OpenAI and Google as key suppliers. You went from dealing with tiny app makers that were relatively, they were price takers, not price setters. You'll flip that completely on its head if you have nothing that is even remotely comparable.
Yeah, it took the app maker behind Fortnite to get large enough to be able to challenge them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Right.
they were fortunate to have very sympathetic judges in that
Right.
case.
Right. Well, next week we'll do NVIDIA, same kind of dissection of NVIDIA, but we have to do a little healthcare before we ring off. So, Jason, what have we got for news in our healthcare?
Some big M&A deals were announced. You know, we predicted at the beginning of the year that M&A and pharma was going to pick up. Lilly is spending $7.8 billion to acquire Contessa Pharmaceuticals. They make treatments for sleep disorders. And then Biogen announced a $5.5 billion deal for Apellis Pharma, and they have a couple drugs that treat kidney disease and then a form of retinal disease. Besides that, the other big news that came out today was Lilly announced the approval of their pill form of a weight loss drug, Foundayo, I believe. I don't know. I've never heard anyone pronounce it. I just saw the press release, Foundayo. They also said they're going to sell it through Lilly Direct. So this is their direct-to-patient platform. Starting price is $149 a month, and then it can be as little as $25 a month with discounts. And I think really the key thing about this is a new form of molecule in this class of medication. And what I mean is this Lilly's new drug is a small molecule, whereas all the other approved treatments are peptides. So a small molecule is dramatically easier to manufacture and transport. It won't have any of the refrigeration issues that the drugs have today, no cold chain. And their profit margin on this particular drug is going to be a lot higher. They can undercut the price of all the peptides. So it's going to be extremely hard to compete with Eli Lilly in this space now.
That's fascinating. Lilly's very strong, aren't they?
They are, yeah.
And it's not just the weight loss drugs, but just in general. What do you think it is about Lilly? Is it they're in the middle of the country rather than either coast, or how do you account for their overperformance?
I don't know. It'd be interesting to do a deep dive to think about that. So all these weight loss drugs started out as treatments for diabetes. And once they realized it had weight loss applications, Eli Lilly in particular went after a lot of the startups developing the early stage version of these. And they acquired a lot of drugs.
Which I think put a little bit of a bad taste in our mouth about it because they shelved a lot of them.
Right.
They're in effect eliminating competitors.
Yep. Or at least putting stuff on the sideline for later.
Right. Before anyone else was looking.
Yeah.
Yeah. $8 billion of free cash flow. Now it's pretty expensive.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty much $1 billion. Excuse me, $1 trillion. For $8 billion of free cash flow. Why don't we do this in the coming week or two? Mike and I, Jason, were talking about NVIDIA this morning and how they progressed from being chips to kind of doing almost everything. So why don't we hit that? Why don't we try to do that next week? And then on the healthcare part next week, answer this question: What gives Lilly its moxie? Their revenue's up 30%. Their free cash flow is up 20%. I mean, they just seem to outshine everyone, the whole rest of the industry.
Yeah, that sounds great.
We're over, of course, and we did get some healthcare in. So everyone be well and stay healthy, and we'll see you exactly 7 days from now. Thanks very much for listening. Take care.
The views expressed on this podcast are the host alone and do not constitute an offer to sell or a recommendation to purchase or a solicitation of an offer to buy any security nor a recommendation for any investment product or service. While certain information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, neither the host nor any of their employers or their affiliates have independently verified this information, and its accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Accordingly, no representation or warranty, expressed or implied, is made as to, and no reliance should be placed on, the fairness, accuracy, timeliness, or completeness of this information. The host and all employers and their affiliated persons assume no liability for this information and no obligation to update the information or analysis contained herein in the future and may or may not hold positions in the securities mentioned.